Hi, I'm Greg Larkin. You know that image you've seen in Inc. magazine of this 26-year-old millionaire who just sold his startup? Yeah, I've seen that image too, and I can say that after 10 years working on startup M&A, that the reality is something fundamentally different. In my 10 years of working in startup M&A, I have never met a single founder or a single acquirer who wouldn't go back and do it differently. And many of those founders and many of those acquirers had successful acquisitions. And that fact is underpinned by the data. More than 70% of startup M&A ends in failure. 62% of founders don't see their options fully vest because they don't last long enough in the acquiring company. And that's why I created Bowery 315, and that's what we're going to cover in today's presentation. I'm going to share with you the things that I wish I knew before my first exit 10 years ago. Because since then, I've gone on to make startup M&A a success. I have worked with acquirers in the Fortune 100. I have worked with startups that have gone on to make millions. And I've worked as an advisor. And in the process of making startup M&A work, I find that many of the tools run totally counter to the conventional wisdom of what you're supposed to do. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. This presentation is broken down into 3 sections. In section 1, we're going to have a sneak peek at what life is really like after M&A. In section 2, we're going to explore a technique for better M&A, agile M&A. And in section 3, we're going to figure out, once you go through a more agile and iterative process, then what do you do? How do you find the right level of alignment and integration? A good place to start is to ask, why do companies acquire startups? Because the stated reason is always a small piece of the total reason. The stated reason is that usually that a startup has innovation that a larger company couldn't create on its own. And on paper, that's a very good premise, and I've worked with a lot of companies that take that premise and add layers that the startup doesn't have access to, like stronger capital and better go-to-market solutions and a larger, more widely recognized brand. But if that were the full reason, no startup M&A would fail. And in reality, there's always a few other reasons that once you know them, you have a better understanding of what life is going to be like after the deal closes. The most obvious question to ask is, why can't that company innovate? And that's a really important issue, because if a company struggles with innovation because of process and because of people, and it then acquires a very innovative startup, they also might take away the value of the startup by making it more difficult for them to innovate going forward. That should be a determinant of the right level of autonomy for the startup after the deal closes. A second thing you're going to learn is that the people who broker the deal, the wedding planners, so to speak, the lawyers, the bankers, the investors, you're never going to see them again after the deal closes. Much of what they say and do is mission critical for the deal to go through, but you have to balance the insight from the wedding planners with insight from marriage counselors. By marriage counselors, I mean people who have gone through M&A before and have an understanding of how to make this integration successful. Another thing you find on the other side of startup M&A is that very often superstar startup founders struggle as corporate executives. What a good startup founder can do is solve a problem in an innovative way with very few resources and very little structure. And very often, that skill isn't able to flourish in a corporate environment where typically there's a bit more structure and there's more rules and there's hierarchy. And they might leave eventually. And in leaving, they might take a lot of the value of the startup with them. So finding the right level of integration for the startup and the right level of space that the founder needs in order to continue creating value with the startup is pretty important. A fourth thing you're going to learn is that very often the reason that the startup is being acquired has more to do with other startups that the corporation has acquired in the past that might not be working out so well. And that often has a huge ramifications for the level of independence and raises some questions about trust. If you're being promised a large level of autonomy in the due diligence stage, but in reality, there's another startup that the company acquired earlier that isn't working out as successfully as they would have liked, very often that autonomy is an empty promise. They're going to want you to work very closely with that startup to get it back on track and make that acquisition work. And that's not necessarily a deal breaker, but you need to have an understanding of what went before and what is expected of you to deliver vis-a-vis that earlier acquisition. And finally, and this is going to take us into agile M&A, something you're going to also learn as a corporate acquirer is that the real level of maturity of a startup only really emerges after the deal closes. And that has an enormous impact on the level of integration after a deal. The conventional wisdom of startup integration is that if it's a less mature startup where it has good people and good technology, but its systems for executing haven't really hit their stride yet, that you're supposed to grant the startup a strong degree of autonomy. Conversely, if it's good at executing it, it has go-to-market systems and product development systems that are working, that you should integrate it fully and do it fast. And for the most part, I would say that that holds true, but it also skips a very important step, which is that the true level of maturity of a startup as it's presented during due diligence is very rarely the full truth. And that's why I developed Agile M&A. Agile M&A is the process of going on a few dates before you move in together. In step one of Agile M&A, you're building a blended team. That should be no more than 7 people, and it should include one product manager and then a mix of other developers and designers and go-to-market people from both the corporate acquirer and the startup. And in step 2, you are going to identify the problem owner that you think you can serve. The premise of good startup acquisitions is that there is an entrenched problem in the market that as a combined entity, you're going to be able to solve better than the incumbent solution that is already out there. And in order to prove that, you have to identify who the specific user is. And when you develop a persona, that's what you're honing in on. You're looking at what are users' activities that they go through every day to solve the problem that you think you can solve. But in the pain points section is where you start to focus on what is suboptimal about the solutions that are in the market. And from there, you start to form a hypothesis of how you can do it better than what's already out there. And in step 3, you embark on a 4-week experiment to prove this out. You build something to solve the problem that you identified. In week 1, you're building out the persona and creating a strategy for the solution that you want to build. In week 2, you're building a prototype. In week 3, you're validating that prototype with user tests. And in week 4, you're presenting that prototype. There's a bunch of things you can learn in 4 weeks. Do we work at the same speed? Do we work well together? Does our leadership work well together? Does the market get excited about what we can build together? And finally, is anybody lying? Is there a distortion or a promise that was made by the corporation or by the startup that is disproven to such an extent that we don't think we have a trustworthy counterpart? Uh, that's an extremely difficult thing to unearth in conventional due diligence. Because once you do that, you're in a position to make much smarter decisions about the right level of integration. And that takes me into part 3 of this presentation. The conventional wisdom is that if it's a young startup, you're supposed to leave it independent. Well, you might have a much more accurate understanding of the level of maturity of the startup. It could also play out that the conventional wisdom doesn't apply, that it's a mature startup that should be left independent, or it's a young startup that should be fully integrated. You have to let the 4-week experiment determine what's right for you. You get such better outcomes from this that for years make founders happier, make acquirers happier. And in conclusion, you have to understand that the stated reason for the acquisition is always part of a much larger truth, and you need to know the full reason for the deal. One way to discover that truth is through agile M&A. Go on a few dates to answer questions about cadence, culture, executive leadership, and integrity. And use agile M&A to form a better plan for the right level of integration. And finally, I'd also love to hear if you've had an experience with startup M&A which is closely aligned with my experience, or not. If you've had an experience where you do use the conventional tools and they've worked very well for you, I also want to hear that. So thank you very much and good luck.